introduction. Do you need an introduction, or do you want me to go ahead and speak? Or
No, you can go right ahead.
okay. Then I can use the mouse to change it, right?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, fabulous. All right. Okay, for those of you tuning in virtually, thank you guys for watching. I'm at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. Good to be in the Tar Heel State next door from Virginia. And we're going to present on how conservation is conservative and what that all entails. So this is a really fun lecture. I've had a lot of people request it, and you're going to hear me talk more about it, but really good to be here on this beautiful spring day in nearby North Carolina. What is my story? I'll keep it condensed, of course, but more broadly speaking, I'm a proud conservative. I've worked in conservative politics. Like you guys, I was a college student as well. Back in my day, I went to UC San Diego, had some groups there, wrote for the conservative paper, so I can empathize with what it's like to run an organization and what it all entails and about different issues. So it's good to come back to universities now in the capacity that I do and tell my story, talk about subjects like this, about how conservation is conservative. And I do a lot of stuff. I won't bore you with all of my resume, but I am kind of like a multi-hyphenate. I do communications as part of my client work with a group called the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. And they're a free market environmental group. They sponsor my podcast called District of Conservation, which is published pretty frequently, a few times a week. I'm also a regular columnist with Town Hall, and I'm an award-winning outdoor writer. And in addition to my media work, I also do some fellowships with the Independent Women's Forum, where I'm a visiting fellow, and also with Young Voices, where I've just graduated to become a regional leader as part of the regional leaders program, and I'll be representing the Northeast very soon. And I'm also personally a hunter, angler, and gun owner as well. So I think I'm a little bit qualified somewhat to speak on conservation issues and kind of relate to them from a personal basis and communicate to you guys about conservation. Now, this lecture will explore three main points, and I've added a fourth section, but it all relates interrelated together. And I'll explain how conservation is in sync with political conservatism, what the left gets wrong about conservation, and how conservatives can win on the environmental issue. And I want to preface my conversation and this discussion with my kind of usage between conservation and environmentalism. And when I'm talking about conservation, I'm talking about environmentalism because they're kind of interrelated. And I think environmentalism has become quite a dirty word. And so conservation kind of placates and plays better and is more received well. So I think conservation and environmentalism as one and the same. The first point I want to argue is that political conservatism and conservation can coexist and that they're not at odds with one another. You guys have probably often been told, or you've heard the retort on these three things especially. They accuse conservatives, the environmental left in particular, of being despoilers of land. We want to pollute and destroy every parcel of land. We're told that we hate the environment. We just want to ruin it with free enterprise and capitalism and energy exploration and other development types, and that we routinely and often support dirty air and dirty water. I've heard these three things my whole political career. I can tell you that those accusations are far from true, especially given kind of the work I've seen conservatives do in politics, outside of politics with respect to environmental issues. I've seen it in my reporting work. I've seen it with my video series and many, many other examples, anecdotally and also through evidence. But I'm here to tell you that conservatives are not these three things. They're not terrible towards the environment. And I wanted to include a picture of myself showcasing kind of how I spend time in nature and wanting to add some context behind why there's kind of this not symbiotic, but rather a synergy between conservative. And you want to look to the word conserve. It's not exactly translatable into conservative, but you kind of see the root, conserve without the E. The conservative and conservation, you can kind of see it there. And I'm explaining the different definitions for those of you watching virtually. But obviously, conservatives support the traditional order and limited change to radical changes that happen. It doesn't mean you're immune to changing or you're behind the times. It just means you want to preserve different things. And we can take that mindset of wanting to preserve timeless traditions, or let's say hand down traditions from hunting, fishing, the like, or land stewardship, ranching. That can be applied to environmental stewardship or conservation, which is the wise use of management or wise use of natural resources to prevent exploitation, destruction, and neglect. And that's from Merriam-Webster, both of these definitions. Actually, one from dictionary.com, other from Merriam-Webster. So I want obviously to hone in on the fact that there are similarities in terms of the root word, however imperfect it is, but you can use the philosophy of conservatism and translate that into conservation. And I think, like I said, vice versa, and kind of note the similarities between the two. But it's in our nature to be cliche, I guess, to be conservationists. I don't know why the image is not showing, but it's of an elk that I took a picture of in Virginia. And to continue off of the point of conservation being in our nature as conservatives, you probably often hear here in North Carolina and elsewhere that, hunters, anglers, probably not so much ranchers, but other tenders to the land, farmers, landowners for the most part, because ranching, there is rodeo in the South, but it's not as common as out West. But you do have some form of ranching. You're not as prominent as in Texas or, like I said, Mountain West. But we do know conservationists in these different fields, recreationally speaking, or in different professions and industries. And I think what the left often gets wrong is that why would someone work in an industry that is rooted in stewardship and want to destroy their livelihood? Like if they're a farmer, why would they want to destroy the land that they cultivate and that they tend to? Makes no sense. Why would an angler or hunter want to destroy the stream that they fish in or the pocket of public land that they hunt respectively if they have the interest of wanting to conserve it? So I think that's a question we have to pose to the left in terms of, well, we're not against it because we recreate or we make a livelihood off of it. Why would you want to destroy it? So we have to, I think, punch back like that in terms of explaining like it's actually not counterintuitive to hold these political views while also living out these lifestyles. And I think empirically speaking, we have the evidence on our side. And I'm pulling from a study from the National Wildlife Federation from 2012. The numbers are a little dated. I haven't found anything recent, but this is a pretty good authority on kind of the voting habits of true conservationists. And maybe the numbers have changed a little bit in recent years, and maybe this year with it being a decade, perhaps the numbers will change. But predominantly what they found was that hunters and anglers tend to be Republican and conservative, and they view conservation equally as important as gun rights. It's pretty cool. And when they broke down the numbers of those that they polled, they said that 42% were Republican, 32% were independent, 18% were Democrat. And of those who were polled, 50% considered themselves conservative, of which 22% of those 50% are very conservative. So the numbers don't lie, given the initial empirical, or the, I would say, available empirical evidence to that. And you just kind of look anecdotally at who is funding money, who is traditionally buying guns, although gun owners are now kind of changing demographically, a little bit politically, but we will see if that translates. I'm going to explain more about how gun and ammunition purchases kind of fund conservation. But now more so about what the left gets wrong about conservation. What can be argued, and something that I typically do in my reporting work or consulting work, I want to often make the correction between the different strains of environmentalism. We have environmentalists with a lot of power and a lot of influence and a lot of public sway in the media who say they're conservationists. And then you hear them arguing for no hunting on certain public lands. They're arguing for no balanced use, no ranching on public lands, no grazing, no oil and gas leases on public lands. And they have this philosophy of do not touch, and only a few select people who think like them can access that. And that is what is known as preservation. And it's often conflated with conservation or true conservation. And the differences definitely need to be pointed out. And that's what I want to do in this slide. So preservation is something we can see right now in politics, especially. I call it status quo environmentalism, or what the kind of prevailing attitudes are. And it's essentially when government has an oversized role in the decisions relating to environmental policy. We are seeing this very much prevalent in this new administration, in the Biden administration, and it's a top-down approach with regulation. You have to add regulation in their mind to protect the environment, and we're starting to see cracks in that argument. And then you have true conservation. What they try to conflate with preservation, I would say it's kind of this emerging strain of environmentalism, and that it's more rooted in kind of public-private partnerships, limited government, and even free market environmental thinking when it comes to conservation efforts. And it largely empowers individuals and not so much the government to take initiatives when it comes to environmental problems and finding solutions. And so that's something I want to take away from that and communicate to everyone who's watching virtually and also here in person, that this is something how you have to think of environmentalism now, because what is told as environmentalism is not. It's often muddled with conservation, and then you see it's obviously not conservation, and they confuse a lot of people, and perhaps it's deliberate. I think it can be argued that their machinations are deliberate to confuse people about what environmentalism is. They think they have a hold over it, and that is very misleading. And kind of an explanation between the two differences. So preservation protects the environment from harmful human activities. It's no use in this respect. Typically, what I have found that preservation is defined by is usually very alarmist in nature, does not like the market, doesn't like market solutions to environmental problems, and often it's associated with anti-capitalist attitudes. Typically, when it comes to the energy portfolio, because conservation can include energy development as well, it usually is very selective in terms of what energy would be explored in the stewardship of land or in the use of land. And they tend to incline themselves to alternative energy sources, particularly solar and wind. Very rarely would they use nuclear, and fossil fuels, forget it. Domestic mining, they prefer to take critical mining deposits from outside of the United States. They often, they're starting to work with individuals and private entities, but you still kind of see a demonization of volunteerism and kind of private individuals at work. And they really, really love preservationists to use global non-binding treaties with countries that are not serious about the environment, like China and Russia. Now, on the opposite end, what conservation is, it protects the environment through responsible use of natural resources. So you have no use preservation, which is what we're seeing now, kind of this last vestige of it, because I think people are waking up to the fact that if we have no use, nature will take its course, and it could be just as detrimental as having too much use. And so this is the responsible or wide use conservation, or it's better known as stewardship. What I typically like to say in terms of what it's defined by is individuals, private interests, leading efforts, and you can have public-private partnerships, of course. It is also defined by balanced use or multiple sustained yield management of public lands. You have stakeholder cooperation between landowners, conservationists, industry players, states and the federal government. So you start to see more people come to the equation. What I've noticed whenever there are more left-leaning administrations, they tend to exclude stakeholders. So I've heard from different people who typically partake in negotiations or commentary. A lot of them don't feel like they have a voice right now. They did in the previous administration, but they feel like their interests are not being heard now. So you often hear that it kind of excludes certain interests that play a very integral role in conservation. So that's kind of a brief overview as to the differences between that when you're looking at the grand scope of environmentalism. Now, who contributes more to conservation? We often hear radical environmentalists, especially those of the left's persuasion, say that they're the biggest conservationists, they do the most, they pull the legwork. But if you actually look and examine the funding of conservation and who is directly funding it, it's primarily people who hunt and fish, believe it or not. And I'm not just making this up out of thin air. This is actually known through a law called the Pittman-Robertson Act, where after a time when there was market game hunting and kind of unregulated hunting, hunters and anglers recognized that if they were to deplete the resources too much and they overhunted or overfished everything, there wouldn't be game to pursue down the road. So they had a reckoning in the late 1800s and said, we need state wildlife agencies, we need some accountability, we need to not deplete everything. And so they devised eventually a law called the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. And it's kind of an old law, but it's been there for a long time. And that kind of helps with determining and distributing and kind of explaining the full scope of how those monies are collected and distributed. So you have excise taxes collected on guns and ammunition, fishing tackle, boating equipment, and archery, bow archery. And those are collected under this law through the Department of Interior. Then they disperse it to the 50 states according to how much is generated. So the states essentially get a lot of money, especially from hunters and anglers. And actually there was a $400,000 or $400 million increase from last year. Actually, no, 1.1 billion to 1.5 billion. I'm not going to do math right now. I'm good at math, but there was an increase from, let me correct the record, an increase from 1.1 billion generated in 2021 or 2020 to now 1.5 billion that was generated in 2021. So last year, so there was a huge increase in conservation funding as reported by the Fish and Wildlife Service because more people were taking it to the field going hunting. And like I said, those are collected from guns and ammunition, mostly through the wildlife and sport fish restoration programs. And I can explain more in Q&A about what those are. But the proof is in the pudding that hunters and anglers, not so much bikers and hikers, contribute the bulk of funding as it goes for restoration of habitats and wildlife conservation efforts. It doesn't mean that they don't contribute privately and other ways, but the evidence is clear that hunters and anglers pay the lion's share of conservation efforts. How have conservatives advanced conservation or environmental stewardship in government? Now, this is not perfect. I've had criticisms of different agencies, and I have, different opinions about TR. I like TR, Theodore Roosevelt, for establishing the National Park Service, but he's a little too progressive for my liking when it comes to other areas. The EPA, I think, was a necessary agency, but when it buoys back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations, it gets complicated, and sometimes they get too powerful, and we're starting to see that again. And that was under Nixon. So Republicans, conservatives get credit with the EPA National Park Service creations. And even with, let's say, the recent exit, although I think this new administration is getting us back into the Paris Accords, we did see a huge decrease in carbon emissions when the Trump administration was in office. Also, the Endangered Species Act, which is a very seminal law with protecting species on the verge of extinction, founded under Nixon. And there was a lot of actually conservation legislation passed under the Trump administration. We had the Modern Fish Act, which brought recreational fishing into the modern day, where it wasn't as regulated as commercial fishing. It was regulated separately. We also had the Great American Outdoors Act, which is probably one of the most consequential conservation bills that was passed in 50 years, signed into law by him. There are a few others, quite actually more, but I'm just listing a few examples. The Accelerating Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act, America's Conservation Enhancement Act, and then we actually did see one of the largest expansions of hunting and fishing lands on public lands under the Trump administration, which actually a radical environmental group is now challenging in court, and the Department of Interior may settle with them. We saw that they went into a sue and settle agreement, which could be very disconcerting if they did settle with them and agreed to scale back the new openings. But we did see a lot of good stuff take place in recent Republican administrations, and if you look through the history of it. What does environmentalism look like, or what does conservation look like now? I believe we are shifting more towards a preservationist outlook when it comes to environmentalism. It kind of is really similar to what happened under the Obama administration, and especially in wake of current events. We see that there's a refusal to open up new leases to oil and gas. We have a lot of very kind of suspect people. We have former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy back. She's a climate advisor, and same with former Secretary of State John Kerry, who's also the climate czar as well. The new Interior Secretary, while she is a trailblazer in her own right with the native and tribal perspectives, she was an original co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, and has supported some bans on forms of hunting. And then you have the various different people at EPA and the Energy Secretary, Secretary Granholm, who used to be Michigan governor, who has kind of laughed off about energy independence, and she's compromised kind of with a group called Proterra. She kind of enriches herself with this electric bus company. So we have a lot of people who have either radical positions or they're kind of compromised with double dipping in the government work and then also with private interests. The Biden administration has done a lot to undo previous, let's say, deregulating of any obstacles to energy independence. We saw obviously on the first day of Biden's administration, the Keystone Pipeline was canceled, no new oil and gas leases, the moratorium on ANWR, and lots of other things. And in response, we've seen a lot of people sue to prevent those policies from going into place. And while there's a lot of stuff happening, we do see kind of an interesting kind of divide even among preservationist environmentalists or kind of status quo environmentalists. You kind of see with the whole battle of wind, you see that species conservationists are kind of at odds with wind and solar companies, which is a really interesting dynamic that I haven't really seen before, but it's a lot more obvious now. And then they have to come to the fact that if they want to have a clean energy agenda as they're pursuing and genuflecting on, they're relying too much on countries like China and countries in Africa when they could critically mine and process here in the United States if they want to get solar up there. So they have some problems within their own factions. They're not aware of kind of the realities of limitations with their refusal to do domestic exploration in some regards, although they have said we want to do clean energy development on public lands instead of oil and gas leases, which is interesting to say the least. But they're running into some problems, legally speaking, and then also within their own movement. How is the Biden administration pushing preservationist kind of big government policies? Like I said, you guys are probably well aware, everyone has talked about this on the news cycle in wake of the Ukrainian attack from Russia, the moratorium on new oil and gas leases. They don't want to open up new LNG ports or new natural gas pipelines. They've also tried to do this through a review of the oil and gas leasing program to say no new onshore, offshore oil and gas exploration. And that why that's important also, people don't know the connection between actually this one program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that if you don't have offshore exploration, especially from oil and gas royalties, you're going to kind of choke the funds of LWCF, which comes from offshore exploration, largely from oil and gas. So they're hurting and undermining longstanding programs by doing that. And also rejoining the Paris Accords. We really didn't need to rejoin it to be a standard or to create a standard for clean environment, environmental stewardship, but it's more of a virtue signal. But they wanted to do it. Obviously, they continue to rely on foreign countries. There still is a refusal to drill here, even in wake of what is happening in Ukraine. There's a new biodiversity initiative called 30 by 30, which could infringe upon private property rights. And that's something I've written on and I can explain more later. And then they've also done things where this can actually limit access, even under the guise of saying we're expanding public lands access, to expand national monuments, and then also wilderness areas, which can have a disproportionate effect on public land users at times. We've seen case studies in Arizona, Utah, some other places where when they put these kind of protections in place, it does limit the public from accessing it, which is very counterintuitive to public lands. I want to finish off my lecture by saying how conservatives can win on environmentalism. I don't want to just talk about the negatives, the differences, but I think talking points you can use to really clue people in and bring them in. And these are just kind of my suggestions with how I've been able to get people to pay attention more. And I think it could work for your organization and for those of you watching and listening. I think we should definitely tie energy independence, energy dominance to national security. A lot of people are. And I think that's a very appropriate thing to do. You can obviously look to see what happens with Russia, a large dominator of oil and gas in the global sphere, and what it did in Ukraine, how European countries are reliant on Russia, and how them being the dominant player in the oil and gas market has led to us not using fossil fuels cleanly and safely, and how we've been pushing a clean energy transition, and yet these countries are still using fossil fuels, but we're transitioning, they're not. Kind of point out the hypocrisies there. I think you can advocate for market-based or limited government solutions. A lot of people are talking about this. You even see a little bit on the left talking about how you can do this with conserving a species, with creating wildlife corridors, with creating a new technology to clean up invasive aquatic species of plants. I've seen that firsthand, a really cool thing in Florida called aquaculture, and it's phenomenal what they do to clean up noxious weeds. I also think we can decouple from climate issues more, because we have a problem where we're too much focused on the climate. Not that it's not an important thing to focus on, but I think if tying everything to climate, you're not going to get people who may be open to environmentalism to consider it, because not everything is about climate. You can divorce it from different issues and then get people to think about climate. So I think decoupling it a bit from the lexicon of environmentalism is wise. It doesn't mean you don't care about it. Plenty of people focus on the climate, but I think individual issues deserve individual attention. I think advocating for an all of the above energy policy is still wise to do. It's not a fool's errand, but I think, especially kind of the shortcomings we're seeing with clean energy, especially leaning on oil and gas, natural gas, and especially nuclear, which is the true clean energy source, I think that's a wise thing to do. I think in the instances where you do advocate for solar and wind, it shouldn't be the dominant kind of energy source on the electricity grid. I think it's not there yet. And so you can obviously explore it on a case-by-case basis, but it can't be the dominant energy source. In Virginia, I was looking at the Energy Information Agency, and I saw that we still primarily power our grid through natural gas, like 61%. 29% is nuclear, and then I think it was biofuel, and then coal was 4%, and then biofuel or renewables. So renewables still have a very small share, but nat gas and nuclear are the two dominant electricity sources that we power our state through. And I think it's maybe similar in North Carolina, but a lot of states are not there yet to transition. So it'd be premature to say, let's fully transition when the inefficiencies are very clear. And then I think if you want to make that argument, in doing so, you could point to the hypocrisy and high cost of transitioning away, because the more there was a study from the Associated Press, and I think UChicago, they did a joint poll together that said, with every $10 increment increase in energy bills, the less people were inclined to support these clean energy or these kind of climate-centric policies. So when it hits your pocketbook, you're not so much inclined to adopt those policies. So it's really interesting how the financial factor comes into play with that. But I think point out the hypocrisy and then the high costs. In Virginia, we have these different pieces of legislation. We're going back and forth about pulling ourselves out of this regional greenhouse gas initiative, which a lot of people want to see us removed from. Rightly so, because it really doesn't lower our overall emissions and it incurs more of a cost onto our ratepayers and other things like that. So people see that the costs are increasing for energy in Virginia, and they're like, why did we get into this? But it was because the previous people in charge, when it was a fully kind of left-leaning administration before this new administration, Youngkin's administration, came in, people just didn't know. So they just accepted it as fact. It was passed on party lines. But I think tying the costs to these emerging technologies is extremely important. It doesn't mean you dislike it or you're a denier, but I think people will see through that evidence to be like, yeah, maybe it's a valid statement to point out that the costs are higher. Maybe it's not as sustainable as we'd like it to be. Maybe down the road it can be, but right now it's not. Two books I want to recommend. I don't know if you guys can read it, but I read this book and I really loved it. It's called The Blue Mind by Wallace J. Nichols, and he's a marine biologist. And he said, and I'm going to read briefly from this, that a lot of people cry wolf in environmentalism. And I don't think he's a conservative gentleman. Maybe he's in the middle, maybe he leans more left. But he said people won't respond positively when we bore the heck out of them with a lot of facts. They won't respond when we make them feel guilty or bad about themselves. And that's what he believes the environmental movement is doing, scaring people, making them feel bad, and overloading them with data. So if we have someone like this, an established marine biologist, even saying this, goes to show that maybe the environmental movement is recognizing that they've overstepped their bounds. They've made people, self-hating. Maybe they've made them anxious and angry. And I really love this book because I love water sports. I love fishing, boating, things of that sort. And so this is a great book. And for those of you tuning in virtually, this is an excellent book as well to watch or to read. And then another popular book, I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Michael Shellenberger, and he's actually been speaking out a lot against kind of the shortcomings with renewables, especially solar and wind. And he wrote a book called Apocalypse Never, which became a bestseller. And he's probably one of the leading people who used to be one of the go-to climate people. He regrets kind of scaring the populace with some of his past rhetoric. And he's kind of wanted to build back his graces with the public and kind of atone for some of the alarmism that he contributed to. So you see a lot of established people with very, very long established credentials, even saying like, maybe we jumped the gun, maybe we were a little too extreme. And so his book is also great, and he's just a great person to look to in terms of an inspiration or like a guiding light. Now, steps for kind of taking what I've given you to incorporate it into your organization or to whatever you want to do. I think a problem the right often falls into is we just kind of repeat environmental talking points from the left, but we put a Republican bow on it. And I think that's a very, very bad mistake to do. And if you want to learn how to craft talking points and get people interested, I'm happy to dispense on talking points and be a resource. I think also being action-oriented, not going on the defensive always, but going on the offensive is extremely important. Joining a true conservation or a conservationist organization, lots of hunter organizations, lots of birding groups, lots of great groups out there. So I can certainly connect you to some. I think following free market organizations, there are many out there, are also great. And then telling your own story. We always talk about pathos and emotion and how we can appeal to people. And I think doing that is probably the surefire way to get people to sympathize with you. If I tell my fishing story or I tell my conservation story, a lot of people like that better than me just dispensing on facts. So I think telling your story about how you got involved in the environment or how you got involved in hunting, fishing, conservation will sell really well. And I'll leave you with this quote from Aldo Leopold about the public or the private landowner who conserves the public interest. A good takeaway from that. And last but not least, obviously for those in attendance, 2 opportunities I briefly want to share. My client/partner CFACT has a Dreesen fellowship that's paid. So if you want to work more closely on environmental issues, you can get paid to do so. And you will work with a great mentor. And sometimes I think some of the fellows may work with me. I don't really do much with the fellowship program, but I do interact with some of the Dreesen fellows. And it's a great program. You'll work one-on-one with people, get great opportunities. And if you want to really just go full throttle with free market environmentalism, that's a great way. And then Young Voices, as I alluded to earlier with me being a regional leader, I don't have the North Carolina region in my region, unfortunately, but I can connect you to the gentleman, one of my cohorts, who is in the North Carolina region. I would love to connect you to him, but it's a great kind of media fellowship to get yourself put into publications, to do radio, TV. Excellent program if you want to focus on the energy and environment beat, a great way to do it, but also with other center right issues. But that's kind of my presentation. I've included all the links to connect me with, social media. Definitely encourage you guys to listen to my podcast too. I talk to newsmakers. We talk about these issues all the time. A lot of people like listening to it because it's kind of a condensed form of like what's happening in DC and different states. So I like to be a resource, and if I can be a connection outside of the presentation, I would love to do that. So thank you guys for having me here at App State. So any questions that I can answer?
I believe I have one.
Sure.
So something I do run into often, just typically when I'm helping students table, are people who are more left-leaning coming after our table and just kind of yelling at us that we don't care about climate change and that's all they want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize in your presentation, you're like, let's try to gravitate away from that a little bit, or just talking about just that.
Mm-hmm.
And so how would you kind of typically respond to someone who only wants to talk about that, or, you know, try to present a different issue? Like, what's a good tactic to kind of use, or a place to start?
Yeah, I think you could say, yes, that is an important issue, and I get your understanding, I get your emphasis, but why don't we talk about an area outside of it that we could work together on, maybe see some coalescence behind, or come to some agreement. And I think you can present it in a way where maybe you'll get some positive reception to it, or if they're not convincing enough, or if they're not, how would you say, if they're not receptive, and then you may just back off discussion altogether if they're too caustic and not interested in dialogue. It depends. You should be able to gauge like how they behave. If they're like, yeah, I'm open-minded to like hearing what your guys' say on environmental issues are, you could say like, it's not like a denying of like climate or anything, but you could say like, okay, that's an important issue, but maybe break it down to like individual issues, because sometimes there's no real application of it. So you could point that out and say like, in this issue, you can't really apply that because it's so technical, or you lose people if you tie those two together. Maybe it's too political to tie them to that. So I think that's a way where you could argue for decoupling, but still trying to find some agreement, I think, with that. But I'm trying to think if that's the best framing from me to you. But I think if you say like, well, hey, this is not really a climate issue, but this is an environmental concern. I think one issue you could talk to people, because you can't really say like climate change is causing plastic pollution, because that's people voluntarily littering more so than, the prevailing changing climate. I think it's people being irresponsible, littering, and that goes into the ocean. So you could talk about plastics pollution, which is actually a really big problem. And it's not really a partisan thing one way or another. You actually could get people on both sides to agree, like, yeah, let's address the public or the plastics issue and see what we could do from there. So like finding an issue where you could get their support, but not having to talk about it, I think is fine, because you can't say like, and they talk about it on the forestry issue. They say like, well, climate change is the biggest factor. It's a contributing factor, but it's not the biggest factor. It's like maybe the third largest factor in it, because you have two other main factors, which are slipping off the top of my head. But if we talked about forest management, I could definitely go more into details about that if I had prepped for it. But they like to say like it's tied to that, but it's just it's a tertiary factor in that. It's not the prevailing. So if you can showcase evidence like it's an important factor, it plays a role, but it's not the main role, there are some ways that you can talk about it. But I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
But I don't think you should be afraid to talk to them. You could say like, hey, let's meet in the middle. We may disagree on this.
Right.
That everything is coupled with climate, and then see where it can go from there. But if they're not rational, then you can avoid talking to them, because there's some people who are unreasonable and you won't be able to have a dialogue with them. You'll say, okay, I enjoyed hearing your perspective, but we're going to agree to disagree, and then you can move on.
Right.
Any more questions?
I just found it really interesting how I never thought about a majority of conservatives are the people that are hunting and fishing. And so, like you said, why would they want to destroy the environment when they're the people using it the most? They're the people like going out into the environment and doing things. And I just never thought about it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah. To go on your point, I think that's what I think people fail to understand, because you see, it's like with the environmental left, it's like a smokescreen. They're talking about all these problems. And then when you dig into it, you see that they're actually the obstacles. So for example, when it comes to endangered species, a lot of these groups, and they have some overlap with left-leaning political groups. So when it comes to endangered species, and these are very controversial species, but I've written about them, especially the grizzly bear out west and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the left loves to play with a political football with this. So when the bear is determined to recover, as it was in 2017, and actually the Obama administration concluded the same thing too. It wasn't just a Trump position. It was actually an Obama Fish and Wildlife Service position plus Trump Fish and Wildlife Service position. It was conclusive across different administrations. And so the bear was to be delisted, and it was delisted. But then environmental groups, because in the state of Montana and Wyoming, they were going to open the hunt, a very regulated, highly regulated lottery hunt to grizzly bear management. A judge intervened, stopped that from happening. Then they continued to sue through that channel. They took it to the Circuit Court of Appeals. The Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in their favor. And then it went back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior under the Biden administration. They said, we have to put back threat and protections on this particular strain of the grizzly bear, although this bear, which is a DPS, it's a separated kind of bear population, but this bear population has far exceeded their threshold of recovery. And so because they're opposed to management by the states, because it could include some form of hunting or big game hunting, they have found a way to use the legal system through this thing called sue and settle, and using the EAJA, this law that's in place that's not meant to be used and to make lawyers rich or to make environmental groups rich, but it's abused. So conservatives often argue that they're undermining environmental progress, especially seminal laws like the Endangered Species Act, because they're suing and settling. They're not allowing the species to get off the endangered species list. They're keeping them in perpetuity with these listed endangered or threatened protection species. And that is very counterintuitive. It's not science-based, it's against wildlife management, and it causes friction. and they're not following the science in this respect. So I think in that case, they just don't know, or they're in denial, or they think they have a monopoly in it because the media is on their side. They have, and look, I love storytelling on Nat Geo and BBC America and those wildlife programs. I don't agree with all their agenda, but it's really visually appealing. So they were never really challenged because they have the academics, they have the entertainment industry, they have media on their side. So people haven't really challenged them or questioned them because they've been there for so long. Since they were the leaders, there wasn't really a conservative response. And so I think people are pushing back now. And even NPR, kind of the article that I showed in The Decline of Hunters, but even NPR and others have recognized that hunters and anglers, who tend to skew conservative, are the main drivers of this funding. It doesn't mean that there are no Democrats or no liberals or no independents. There are plenty of people with other political dispositions speaking and participating, not speaking, but participating, buying. And maybe in the future, it could be evenly divided. We don't know what the political makeup, because it's really hard to gauge with the 16 million or so people who hunt in this country. But it'd be really fascinating to see if, since that 2012 survey, if it's been updated. But yes, it'll still largely be a conservative, I would say, dominated activity because of just kind of the self-reliance that comes with it. The wanting to provide for your family, taking your family out to the field. Second Amendment obviously is kind of tied to it, but it's not obviously a guarantor of hunting. But if you support gun rights, you're largely going to support hunting. Although you do see some hunters who are like, AR-15s are too excessive, or they're too bulky, or they're too automatic, and I don't want to have them, or not automatic, but they're too dangerous aesthetically, excuse me. So we don't want to have them because it could scare off people. We just want to hunt with a short-barreled rifle or traditional hunting rifle, nothing with too many bells and whistles. Although I have hunted with an AR-15, and it's actually a very comfortable platform, suppressed, I may say. But some people, even in the hunting realm, are a little divided, but you do see overwhelmingly it tends to skew more right. But it could change in the future, could be more evenly divided. But like I said, I think because of the inherent values of self-sufficiency, pro-family, support for gun rights, and not wanting gun control, those kind of do overlap with hunting especially. And even with fishing, self-reliance, and then spending time with family. Fishing doesn't get as political as much, except for like PETA saying, like, how dare you eat fish? But you can get people from the right and the left to coalesce a lot behind fishing, because fishing is not as controversial in a sense, although there is controversy with different types of fishing, which I won't go into. But hunting attracts more political dissension because of kind of the overlap with the Second Amendment, people who support the Second Amendment versus people who are not as strong in the Second Amendment in the hunting sphere. But yeah, I think overall it will still tend to lean more right, but it could change. We don't know. And we want everyone to hunt and fish. I'm not saying like only conservatives should hunt or fish. I want everyone of all political beliefs to hunt and fish, and maybe by some accident they will discover conservatism through hunting and fishing, because it's kind of, I've noticed people who were anti-gun who start to go to the range, especially, they like kind of start to shed their previous political orientation. Doesn't always happen, of course, and it shouldn't always happen, but you do kind of see some political changes with people. They moderate a little bit. They maybe go to the middle if they were really, really far to the left. So that does happen by accident. But if we could create extra conservatives through these activities, an added bonus, but it's not a guarantee, but it can kind of maybe explain some changes in political behavior in the future. I would actually love to see, and if I had money, I would love to commission a study about like, do political attitudes change if you partake in certain activities? But that's something I've kind of explored. I hope that answered your question. Anything else? You're done? Yeah. Oh yeah, one more.
Sorry, this might sound a little big, but I remember when I was in school, we would have a biology lab where it was about population control, and about how, like, we had a whole lab and section dedicated to how we should stop having children because
boy.
they're all just terrible to the earth, just carbon footprint. And that's also another main argument that I hear that's just kind of like general and very vague. So how would you suggest responding to that as well?
Did you see Elon Musk's tweet recently?
Recently, no.
Or it was his comments. It was an interview with the Babylon Bee, or either a tweet.
Okay.
I can't pinpoint exactly. It was one of those two. But he, departing from other environmentalists, and I think he considers himself an environmentalist with his EV focus and all. So he departs from a lot of Malthusian population control people by saying having kids is good for the planet. which I loved seeing that turnaround. Personally speaking, I was like, he's not a Malthusian. He's like endorsing you to have kids to sustain, Earth and to sustain society and civilization. So I was like, that may be an emerging kind of component in the environmental movement where you're not shrugging off having kids, although you do see, again, alarmists saying don't have kids because of climate change, don't have kids because of just these different worries, external factors, things of that sort. So he's, I think, the person who could maybe counterpunch or kind of offer a counterweight to that argument with, like, he has a lot of kids. I think, 7, 6, 8. I can't remember how many. He has a lot. He has like over 5 kids, if I'm not mistaken. But he argued that there's nothing wrong with having kids because you can teach them to be good stewards. You can teach them to care. So I think we could use him. He's become kind of an interesting figure. And in pop culture, and say like, hey, if this leading electric vehicle developer is saying this, let's listen to him, see what he has to say. So I think that's a way that we can refute it, and then go from that, because I think that argument is not really substantive much anymore, because like they can argue it, but then you could say the opposite, like, well, what if you don't have a population to sustain? Everyone talks about the declining birth rate, which is a whole separate issue from demographics, and not separate from conservation. But as a conservative, I'm pro-life too. So for me, I was like, oh yeah, that's a big concern. Like fewer people having kids, getting married, things of that sort. But you could tie it into the environmental thing and say like, well, it is actually pro-environment to have kids, and you're not going to make them irresponsible or reckless. You're going to teach them how to take care of their backyard, their surroundings, their table, whatever, however basic it starts. Like if you teach kids responsibility, they're going to care. Like how I was able to care about the surroundings that I like to recreate in. I go fishing. I've gone fishing with my dad. I went to national parks early on, and I was taught a reverence for nature. And if you get that early, you're going to have that. So you could say like having kids and teaching them to be naturalists or to teach them how to be conservationists, it's fine. It doesn't take away from the planet. So I think there's an argument to be made there, but use Elon Musk, I would say, as a point of reference. Anything else? We're good? All right, thank you guys, and thank you to all who are watching. Okay, fabulous.
I would love to get